She sat in the principal's office, eyes red, hair unevenly hacked off. All she could say through her tears was, "She said I looked messy." The teacher thought she'd done the right thing, until her father walked in. Michael B. Jordan, world-renowned actor, producer, and proud dad, didn't say a word at first. He just looked at his daughter, and then at the scissors still on the desk. What happened next wasn't just about hair, it was about dignity, silence, and how one man decided enough was enough. But what do you do when justice threatens to cost you everything you've built? It began on an ordinary Wednesday morning at Wellington Academy, a prestigious private elementary school nestled in the upscale hills outside Los Angeles. 8-year-old Amora Jordan had walked into her third-grade classroom with her head held high, proudly wearing the fresh braids her aunt had done the night before. Adorned with delicate gold beads and tied back with satin ribbon, her hair glimmered in the sunlight as she greeted her friends with joy. But to Ms. Langston, the new substitute teacher brought in to cover for a maternity leave, the beads were distracting. A veteran of school systems in predominantly white suburbs, Ms. Langston had already made a name for herself in her first 2 weeks as strict but polished. What no one expected, least of all Amora, was that by lunchtime she would be sitting in the nurse's office, her braids cut off with school-issued scissors, her scalp raw, and her spirit shattered. The incident, according to Ms. Langston, was a minor grooming correction. She claimed Amora had complained about discomfort and that her unkempt hairstyle had been a learning hindrance. The administration, caught off guard, quietly filed the event as a misunderstanding. The nurse, uncomfortable but unsure what to do, sent Amora back to class after a band-aid and some silence. But the emotional impact couldn't be ignored. Amora, once vibrant and talkative, was quiet for the rest of the day. When asked why her hair was different, she only whispered, because she didn't like it. It wasn't until pickup time that the storm began to form. The family driver, horrified at Amora's appearance, immediately called her mother. Within minutes, the message reached her father, Michael B. Jordan, who was on set but left without hesitation. Word spread quickly through the school's hushed halls. A few teachers were sympathetic, others complicit in silence. One staff member even scoffed, "It's just hair," not realizing who was now en route. When Michael arrived, it wasn't with cameras or lawyers, it was with grief and rage barely concealed beneath the surface. Security was stunned. Parents gasped. Michael B. Jordan walking into a school would normally be headline news. But today, he wasn't a celebrity. He was a father demanding to know why someone had laid hands on his daughter. He didn't yell, at first. He just asked the question that froze the air, "Who gave you the right?" As the principal fumbled for words, and Ms. Langston tried to justify her actions with phrases like appearance standards and school image, Michael's face shifted from disbelief to a cold, focused intensity. He asked to see the scissors. He asked to see the policy. He asked to see the footage. The school had none. What they had, instead, was a stack of vague statements and a deep fear of liability. One parent who witnessed the exchange said later, "He didn't explode, he cornered them with truth." That night, Amora didn't cry. She asked her father if he was mad. Michael knelt, took her hands, and said, "I'm mad at a world that doesn't see how perfect you are. But that changes tomorrow." The school sent out a rushed apology email, framing the event as a miscommunication between staff and student. But Michael didn't respond. He stayed silent online. For 24 hours, no one knew what he would do. The administration hoped it would blow over. They had no idea that Michael wasn't just thinking like a father, he was preparing for something much bigger. He wasn't just going to demand an apology. He was going to demand a reckoning. Because this wasn't about one haircut. It was about every little girl who was told their natural self was too much. Michael sat in his home office that night, eyes locked on the printed copy of the school's official statement, his jaw clenched. The words "unfortunate misunderstanding" replayed in his head like a cruel joke. The statement didn't even mention his daughter by name. No responsibility. No ownership. Just corporate jargon wrapped in legal insulation. Amora had gone to bed early, her eyes heavy from the day's confusion. Michael stood in the doorway of her room for nearly 15 minutes, just watching her sleep, watching the broken braids in the wastebasket beside her dresser. Something inside him, something long buried beneath decades of public grace and professionalism, had begun to uncoil. And as it did, it whispered one truth: this would not end quietly. The next morning, Michael returned to Wellington Academy, not as a grieving father, but as a force. He didn't bring a lawyer. He brought his publicist. He didn't scream. He documented. With cameras trailing discreetly, he walked back into the office, demanded a meeting with the principal, and hit record on his phone. The staff tried to insist on a private discussion, but Michael declined. "I'm here for transparency," he said, voice calm but laced with steel. The principal, a balding man with an ever-present nervous smile, seemed visibly rattled. Ms. Langston was summoned into the room, her arms crossed, her mouth tight with defensive pride. She began again with her excuses, doubling down on discipline and academic focus. But this time, Michael didn't let it slide. He pulled out his daughter's medical file, which showed no lice, no complaints of pain, no signs of discomfort ever reported. He laid it beside the school handbook, now annotated, where nowhere was it written that teachers had authority to alter a child's appearance. Then he laid down a printed list of culturally insensitive incidents from other schools, each one a reflection of the same root issue: black children policed for simply being themselves. "You didn't cut her hair because it was messy," he said. "You cut it because it didn't fit your definition of tidy. And that definition is broken." Word had started to spread beyond the school's walls. A few mothers in the PTA had already begun whispering about what happened. A local community advocate got wind of the situation. And by noon, the first blog post had appeared: Michael B. Jordan's daughter targeted in private school incident. The story hadn't even gone mainstream yet, but the school was already panicking. The principal offered to suspend Ms. Langston pending internal review, but Michael refused the bait. "You don't get to hide her behind a process." She acted. Now face what that means. He then did something that no one expected. He left. Back at home, Michael drafted a letter, not a legal complaint, but a public call to action. In it, he outlined what happened to Amora, connected it to a systemic failure of cultural respect in schools, and ended it with a quote from his daughter: "She said I didn't look right." That sentence, raw and unfiltered, became the title of the post he would soon share across his platforms. He didn't mention the school by name, yet. But the implication was clear. Within minutes, the post went viral. Millions of likes. Thousands of comments. News outlets reached out for statements. Celebrities voiced their support. Former students of Wellington Academy even began to come forward with their own stories of microaggressions and quiet punishments. The school issued another statement, this time filled with desperation. "We are actively investigating," it read, "and we take matters of diversity and inclusion very seriously." But it was too late. Michael had lit the match, and the internet had taken the flame and run wild. Meanwhile, Amora, still unaware of the media storm, stayed home from school, drawing quietly in the living room. Michael sat beside her, watching her sketch a girl with long, flowing braids and a shining smile. "That's me," she said softly. "The way I like it." Michael smiled, but it was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Later that day, the superintendent of the district called him, offering a private sit-down. Michael declined. "We're not going backward," he said. That evening, he appeared on a live-stream interview with a prominent black journalist. For 20 uninterrupted minutes, he spoke not as a celebrity, but as a father and a black man, about dignity, history, pain, and the line that had been crossed. It wasn't rage that captured the audience. It was the quiet intensity in his voice. The restraint. The clarity. "It's not about hair," he said. "It's about who gets to define what's acceptable. And why those definitions always punish the same people." The next morning, a crowd had gathered outside Wellington Academy. Parents, activists, press vans. The school was in chaos. Ms. Langston was escorted out through the back, shielding her face from the cameras. A few faculty members handed in resignation letters, afraid of being swept up in the fallout. The board called an emergency meeting. But Michael wasn't there. He was at a studio lot across town, prepping for a film, but his mind wasn't on the script. Between takes, he read every message of support. Every story that echoed his own. He realized this wasn't just about Amora anymore. This was about every child like her, and every adult like him, who had once sat in a chair while someone else decided their identity was a problem to fix. Later that night, Michael sat again with Amora. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes we speak loudest without raising our voice." Amora nodded, but then asked the one question he hadn't prepared for, "Is she gonna cut someone else's hair?" He looked her in the eye and answered, "Not if I have anything to say about it." And that's when he decided. A public forum. Not just a press release. Not just a story. A reckoning, broadcast for the world to see. The world now knew the story. News anchors debated it, educators dissected it, and activists amplified it. But buried beneath the sound and fury was a deeper truth. One few had the access or courage to uncover. As the media storm intensified, one former Wellington teacher quietly sent Michael an anonymous email with the subject line, "You don't know the half of it." Inside was a link to an encrypted folder and a short message, "She's done this before. And she's been protected every time." Michael sat frozen, then clicked. What he found wasn't just evidence, it was a pattern. The folder contained internal memos, HR complaints, and whistleblower testimonies all tied to Ms. Langston's time at previous schools. There were parent letters reporting cultural insensitivity, instances of disciplinary grooming enforcement, and notes from administrators acknowledging the complaints but choosing to handle them internally. At one suburban academy, she reportedly forced a Haitian boy to wash the oil out of his locks because she said they smelled distracting. At another, she was reprimanded for commenting that a Latina student's hoop earrings were inappropriate for school. None of these actions had cost her a job. In fact, each time she transitioned to a new school, her record appeared clean, thanks to quietly negotiated exits and silenced parents too tired or too alone to keep fighting. Michael's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't negligence. It was systemic insulation. Determined to understand the full scope, he contacted a private investigator he trusted, someone who'd helped him vet producers and background deals in the film industry. The man dug deep, tracing Langston's professional trail through 5 different schools in 12 years. Each stop had its version of the same story. But at Wellington, she'd finally crossed the wrong family. Michael stared at the documents spread out on his kitchen island, each one a shard of a mirror reflecting a larger monster. An educational system that punished children of color under the guise of standards and professionalism. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb an hour away, Ms. Langston was sitting alone in her dimly lit home, watching her world collapse in slow motion. The phone had stopped ringing. Her friends were ghosting her. Her inbox was full of death threats and hate mail. But in her mind, she was still the victim. "They twisted it," she whispered to herself. "I was trying to help." The tragedy of her belief wasn't just her ignorance, it was its roots. Raised in a community where conformity was praised and difference was pathologized, she'd spent her entire life believing she was a savior. To her, Amora's hair was a symbol of rebellion, not beauty. Her scissors were a tool of discipline, not violence. She had no idea the world had moved on from her worldview, or that it had never belonged there to begin with. Flashbacks from Michael's own childhood began to resurface. He remembered the sting of a guidance counselor telling him not to wear cornrows to an audition because they send the wrong message. He remembered the soccer coach who made him sit out unless he tied back his afro because it obscured his vision. He remembered his mother arguing with teachers who called him too loud, too bold, too much. It was the same playbook, repeated across generations, masked by policy and professionalism. And now, his daughter had been drafted into that same painful legacy. One night, Michael found himself at his mother's house, needing her voice, her clarity. He told her everything, the files, the backlash, the decision to go public even louder. She listened in silence, her eyes thoughtful, before placing a hand on his. "This isn't just her story or yours," she said. "It's ours. But you have the power now to make sure it ends differently." It was the affirmation he didn't know he needed. Michael returned home, pulled up the files again, and made a choice. He would share them, not just with the media, but with every parent group, civil rights organization, and educational watchdog that would listen. The next morning, he released a second statement, this time naming names, attaching files, and calling for a full investigation not just into the incident but into how schools like Wellington quietly protect patterns of abuse. He didn't mince words. This is not about one bad teacher. This is about a system designed to protect whiteness at the expense of our children's dignity. The reaction was instantaneous. Hashtags surged. Protests formed. Several of Langston's former students stepped forward with on-camera interviews, their testimonies both heartbreaking and infuriating. And in a stunning turn of events, one former school board member admitted on live TV that Langston had been passed along to avoid legal complications. But even as the public momentum grew, Michael's internal conflict deepened. He watched Amora become increasingly withdrawn. The media frenzy, though protective in intent, had invaded their sanctuary. She missed her friends, her routine, her sense of normalcy. One night, she asked, "Daddy, is this my fault?" The question broke him. He realized he was fighting the right war, but at a cost his daughter hadn't signed up for. That night, Michael sat down and rewrote everything. The narrative, the strategy, the next steps. He wasn't just going to expose Langston. He was going to change the conversation. He contacted education reformers, racial equity consultants, and child psychologists. He began planning something radical, a televised community forum, part town hall, part reckoning, designed to force institutions like Wellington to confront their complicity not behind closed doors, but under lights and cameras. And for the first time in a week, he felt something return to his chest. Purpose, not just rage. Healing, not just fire. Because beneath every headline, every document, every broken braid, was the same question. What will we allow to happen to our children in the name of order? Michael intended to make sure the answer would never be silence again. It started with folding chairs. Dozens of them, placed side by side in the Wellington Academy auditorium, each one labeled with titles like community member, parent, educator, and former student. Michael had rented the space himself, after the school reluctantly agreed under public pressure. They wanted a closed-door settlement. He offered them a spotlight instead. No lawyers would be present. No NDAs. Just truth. At the front of the room stood a clear podium, backed by 3 massive screens. On one screen, the school's mission statement, excellence, integrity, growth. On the second, a slideshow of Wellington's diverse student body, frozen in smiling portraits. And on the third, paused for now, was an image of Amora, before and after the incident, side by side. The room filled quickly. Media outlets lined the walls. National broadcasters secured live rights. Security paced the corners, watching for protesters. But the real tension wasn't outside. It was seated within, where faculty members squirmed under the scrutiny of a community that had come not just for justice, but for truth. Michael walked in quietly. No entourage. No sunglasses. He wore a simple black button-down and jeans. When he stepped up to the podium, the room fell into a vacuum of silence. No teleprompter. No speechwriter. Just his voice. "Before I say anything," he began, "I want you to look at the screens." He nodded to the tech team. The third screen came to life, showing footage from Amora's classroom, unreleased security clips recently obtained. In them, Ms. Langston could be seen gesturing at Amora, pulling her aside, and escorting her out with scissors in hand. There was no sign of discomfort on Amora's face before. But there was confusion. Then fear. Then silence. The room shifted. Gasps. Disbelief. Some faculty looked away. Others leaned forward, stunned. Michael continued. "I'm not here to perform outrage. I'm here because you made a choice that violated a child's body without her consent, without her parents' consent, and under the veil of discipline." He turned toward the administration seated near the front. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. A decision built on decades of conditioning, policy, and prejudice. He paused, letting the words breathe. "The reason this story exploded isn't because of my name. It's because it struck a nerve we've been taught to ignore. A nerve that twitches every time a child is told to shrink themselves to fit inside someone else's comfort. He invited others to the stage. One by one, former students came forward. A black girl who'd been told her kinks were unprofessional. A Middle Eastern boy who was forced to shave his hair during Ramadan for uniformity. A trans teen who was refused access to the correct bathroom until their parents threatened a lawsuit. Each voice chipped away at the illusion of Wellington's pristine image. Parents cried. Teachers looked like ghosts. And the principal? He simply sat still, hands folded tightly, as if holding together what remained of his authority. But it wasn't just about Wellington. Michael turned the lens outward. This school is not unique. This is not an isolated problem. This is a reflection of a system that criminalizes difference and rewards silence. And for far too long, we've let words like policy become shields for prejudice. His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from controlled grief. We're teaching our children to disappear themselves, to comply before they even understand what resistance means. That ends today. A special guest took the stage next, Dr. Evelyn Parks, a child psychologist and diversity consultant Michael had brought in. She broke down the trauma associated with identity erasure in schools, the long-term psychological scars of being policed for your hair, your tone, your body. The auditorium transformed from a forum into a courtroom, and the verdict was deafening. The school's board had no choice but to respond. One by one, they were called to the MIC. Their statements were hollow, each one more rehearsed than the last. We are committed to learning. We are devastated by this incident. We thank Mr. Jordan for his passion. But Michael didn't let them escape. He asked each one a single, pointed question. What will you do? Not feel. Not say. Do. Then, the final moment. Michael called Amora on stage. She stood shyly, her hair still in recovery, her face calm but observant. He knelt beside her, handed her the MIC, and simply asked, "What do you want to say?" Her voice, small but clear, rang out. "Don't touch my hair. Don't touch anyone's hair unless they say yes. And if you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine." The room erupted, not in applause, but in silence. A silence that held more power than any speech that had come before it. That night, the clip of Amora speaking became the top trending video on every platform. Not because she was famous, but because she was undeniable. The school board convened an emergency vote. Ms. Langston was officially terminated. Not resigned. Not on leave. Terminated. New district-wide policies were announced within days, banning unauthorized physical contact and implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff. But for Michael, the biggest victory came later. A week after the forum, he received a handwritten letter from a teacher at a nearby public school. "Because of your story," it read, "I stopped another teacher from punishing a girl for her box braids. She reminded me of your daughter. She reminded me to see." Michael folded the letter and placed it in Amora's journal. The battle wasn't over, but the silence had been broken. And in that silence, something new was finally being heard. In the days following the emotional reckoning at Wellington Academy, a quiet unease began to ripple behind the school's polished exterior. While the public had been moved by Amora's courage and Michael's unwavering stance, behind closed doors, a different kind of panic was spreading. One rooted not in empathy, but in exposure. Emails were flying between board members. Legal counsel was being summoned. But then came the twist no one was ready for. A former administrative assistant, recently let go under suspicious terms, contacted Michael through a trusted intermediary. She didn't want money. She didn't want recognition. She wanted truth. Her message was simple. They knew. And they buried it. The woman, who asked to remain unnamed for her safety, provided a trove of internal documents, email chains, staff memos, disciplinary reports, and even private text messages exchanged between members of the school leadership. Among them was the most damning piece of all, a formal warning issued to Ms. Langston 6 months prior regarding her handling of a similar incident involving another student. A 6-year-old black boy had been sent home because his twists were deemed too distracting, and instead of informing his parents, Ms. Langston had taken it upon herself to try and rebraid a few loose strands in the nurse's office. When the child returned home in tears, his parents had filed a complaint. The principal at the time, still the same, had swept the matter under the rug, issuing a verbal reprimand and labeling the parents overly sensitive. Nothing had been filed formally. No action had been taken. But the paper trail was there. Michael sat in stunned silence as he read through the evidence. He'd fought for weeks believing this was the first time. Now he realized it was a pattern not just of behavior, but of protection. Wellington Academy hadn't failed to act. They had actively chosen not to. The implications were staggering. It meant their entire narrative of being shocked, apologetic, and blindsided was a lie. Carefully constructed, legally crafted, and utterly hollow. At that moment, something inside Michael shifted. Up until now, he'd focused on justice for his daughter, accountability for a teacher. But now, the scope widened. He was looking at systemic rot camouflaged by elite branding. He reached out to his legal team, not for a settlement, but for a strategy. "We're not suing for damages," he told them. "We're suing for disclosure." He wanted everything public, all internal communications, complaint logs, HR decisions. He wanted this case to become the blueprint for every other parent who'd ever been gaslit by institutions that valued image over innocence. But as the lawsuit began to take shape, so did the resistance. The school's legal team struck back with ferocity. They filed motions to dismiss, accused Michael of slander, and even attempted to gag him through a temporary injunction. For a brief moment, the tide looked like it might turn. News cycles began to question his motives. Was this about his daughter, or his brand? Was he weaponizing fame for personal vengeance? Social media grew noisy with conflicting voices. But Michael didn't flinch. He leaned into the heat, released another statement, and shared some of the redacted documents publicly. The effect was immediate. Trust in the school plummeted. Enrollments dropped. Sponsors pulled funding. And still, the most important piece of the story remained buried, until someone finally cracked. One late night, a former board member went on record with a journalist from a major investigative outlet. The interview, aired on national television, was a bombshell. "We were told to prioritize optics over outrage," he confessed. "The school had a crisis playbook. We were trained to de-escalate, not investigate. Every time something like this happened, we followed the same script: apologize, minimize, and silence." When asked about Amora's case, he looked down. "We failed. Not just her. All of them." The interview turned public sympathy back toward the heart of the matter. This wasn't a celebrity scandal. It was a structural indictment. Educational forums across the country erupted in debate. Activists praised Michael for refusing to settle. Parents held school boards accountable. And school districts quietly began rewriting their own disciplinary policies. But amidst the victory, Michael was faced with a crossroads. One of the school's lawyers, now disillusioned with the administration, reached out privately. She warned him that the institution was preparing to offer a massive payout, 8 figures, with the condition that he halt all disclosures and remove the documents from public view. The offer was tempting. With that kind of money, Michael could fund scholarships, build his own educational foundation, and walk away with a symbolic win. But doing so meant silencing the very proof that had ignited the movement. It meant hiding the documents that gave voice to every unseen child. That night, he sat alone in the living room, scrolling through the digital files one last time. Each line, each forwarded message, each blind-copied email told a story of willful ignorance. And then he reached the last page, a photograph of Amora on her first day at Wellington, smiling, unaware. Michael closed the laptop and made his decision. He rejected the payout. Publicly. Loudly. "You cannot buy silence," he declared in a press conference. "Not mine. Not hers. Not anymore." The courtroom battle pressed forward, now with national attention. A judge ordered full disclosure. More families came forward. And a federal investigation into discriminatory disciplinary practices in private schools was officially launched. Michael didn't just refuse their money, he shattered the unspoken rule that privilege protects privilege. And in doing so, he made sure that the next time a child walked into a school with braids, beads, or anything that made them beautifully different, they would not be seen as a disruption, but as a right to be respected. The trial date arrived under a thick cloud of media buzz, but Michael didn't wear a suit. He walked into the courthouse in a simple grey sweater, a nod to the boy he used to be, the boy who'd once been told by a drama coach that his look wouldn't sell to mainstream America. But he'd sold it anyway. Now, he was standing not as a blockbuster icon, but as a father in search of answers that shouldn't have needed to be fought for in the first place. The courtroom was overflowing. Journalists scribbled notes with twitching hands. Cameras captured every flinch from the school's legal team. At the center of it all sat Amora, holding a sketchpad, drawing in silence while history unfolded around her. Michael had prepared her, but nothing could truly protect a child from watching the world debate whether their pain was real enough to matter. Witnesses took the stand. Testimonies poured in like confessionals at a church burning down. Former employees, emboldened by the ripple Michael had started, testified about more buried incidents, more complaints, more children who had been quietly sent home, disciplined, or shamed for how they looked. The school's defense team leaned hard into denial. They argued that Langston was well-intentioned, that mistakes had been misunderstood, that the outrage was amplified by celebrity. But every line fell flat. The documents Michael had released told a story they could not unwrite. When Langston finally took the stand, her voice trembled as she described her version of the event. She still believed she'd done the right thing. "I thought I was helping her feel more appropriate," she said. It was a damning phrase. The judge's brow furrowed. The jury stiffened. No one moved. Michael didn't testify until the third day. When he took the stand, he didn't raise his voice once. Instead, he told stories. Of Amora's birth. Of braiding her hair before her first preschool picture day. Of how she smiled when she looked in the mirror that morning, and how that smile had died when she came home from school after the incident. He spoke of memory. Of heritage. Of how black hair wasn't just hair, it was history, resistance, and joy tangled into every curl. "You didn't just cut her braids," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You cut something sacred. And you told her it was for her own good." The courtroom was silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking. The verdict came quicker than anyone expected. The jury ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Jordans. The school was found liable for violating civil rights, causing emotional trauma, and engaging in a pattern of discriminatory discipline. The court ordered monetary damages, policy overhauls, and public acknowledgement. But that wasn't what caught the headlines. What caught fire was what Michael did next. At the post-trial press conference, reporters expected celebration. They expected victory speeches and bold declarations. Instead, Michael stepped up to the microphone and said something no one predicted. "We won in court," he began, "but that's not the win that matters. The real win will be the silence we replace with truth. The dignity we protect before it's stolen. The trust we build before it's broken." Then he opened a black folder and revealed the foundation he had just launched, the Amora Project. Its mission was simple: provide legal, emotional, and educational support to students of color who experience discrimination in school systems across the country. He pledged his entire monetary award from the case to fund it. But the true climax came quietly, in a moment not captured by press or social media. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the courthouse emptied, Michael and Amora sat alone on a bench near the parking lot. She looked up at him and asked, "Does this mean no one will ever hurt me again?" Michael hesitated. The truth was, he couldn't promise that. The world wasn't built that way. Instead, he pulled a folded letter from his pocket, one he'd written but never sent. It was from his own father, found among old keepsakes after his passing. In it, his father had written, "One day you'll be strong enough to fight for more than yourself. And that day will scare you. But fight anyway." Michael placed the letter in her hand. "This means," he said, "that next time, they won't be able to hurt you quietly." The next few weeks saw sweeping changes across multiple school districts. Policy reviews were mandated. Diversity consultants were hired. The Amora project began receiving calls from families across the country, some desperate, others hopeful. For the first time, they had somewhere to turn. Meanwhile, Wellington Academy issued a final public statement, this time with no spin, no damage control. They admitted fault. They apologized, not in vague terms, but with names, specifics, and plans for restitution. The principal stepped down. The board chair resigned. And Langston, stripped of her license, quietly disappeared from the education field altogether. But not all stories are wrapped in clean endings. In the privacy of their home, Michael still watched Amora flinch when someone reached too quickly toward her hair. She still asked questions like, "Was I ugly that day?" And sometimes, he found her staring at herself in the mirror, tracing the roots of her regrowing braids like she was mapping out pieces of herself that had been taken. Healing was not a straight path. It was a winding road with soft victories and sharp reminders. But every night, as she drifted off to sleep, Michael whispered the same words into her ear, "You're magic. Never let them make you forget it." And somewhere, in a school across the country, a teacher hesitated before commenting on a child's appearance. A principal thought twice before erasing a complaint. A parent felt empowered to speak up. The change wasn't loud. But it was real. And it started with a father, a daughter, a pair of scissors, and a line that should never have been crossed.